Welcome to Let's Talk with Hart Hagen, and I'm joined by Jake Bush. Jake, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay, just holding in there. It's a bit of a dreary day, but just staying upbeat, staying positive, trying to, at least.
Right. Well, we're going to talk about Cowboys and Capitalism today. We're going to continue talking about This Land by Christopher McKetchum. It's about the American West. The subtitle is How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West. This book is about the American West myth versus reality. It's about the cowboy myth, cattle ranchers. It's about the Endangered Species Act. It's about animal cruelty, compliments of the federal government. Um, so the last time we talked about this, uh, Jake, what do you remember about this book? I just think it's one of the best books I've read all year, but what do you remember about it?
The thing that always sticks out to me the most is the myth of the American cowboy and the way that sort of the cowboy mythos and the cowboy ideology has permeated not just our own individual consciousness, but it's kind of laid the foundations for the way that the American business climate functions. And I think that is sort of the linchpin to sort of understanding all of this stuff, is understanding how the way that we have crafted the cowboy myth has continued on to this day to be a really negative influence in the way that we handle the land and other people.
Right. So what struck me last time is that, the cowboy is kind of like there's individualism, but domination. So there's this, oh, I'm going to be individualistic. I'm going to be a cowboy, but then I'm also going to tell you what the hell you're supposed to do. And that just pervades like our foreign policy, American foreign policy. It's like, get her done. It's like, oh, like George W. Bush after 9/11, we're going to kick some ass.
Yeah,
And
the
so,
Toby Keith mentality.
yeah, tell me about that.
Oh man, no, I'm glad you brought this up. This is actually I didn't quite put that together, but I think that you've got a really good point there about how this has affected our foreign policy. Because when I was a kid, I was only 7 years old on 9/11. So pretty much my entire life has been spent with this understanding of shock and awe and all that stuff. And growing up out in the rural South, of course, we listen to a lot of country music, not always the good kind of country music. And Toby Keith was just huge at that time with his Shock and Y'all. Do you remember that? That was his album title right after
Okay.
9/11. It wasn't Shock
Okay.
and Awe, it was Shock and Y'all,
Right. Got it.
which is just
Yeah.
so on the nose.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, I mean, our foreign policy has been dictated by this kind of mentality too. And I didn't really
So when I think of shock and awe, I think of Naomi Klein, who's now on the dark side. But Naomi Klein, and not totally, but she's like the in the genre of NPR. It's like we're going to say the right things, but not really get to the anyway. Don't get me started.
sure.
Naomi Klein has written a great book. Whenever I talk about my political awakening, I name the first two people I name are Noam Chomsky and Naomi Klein. There are a lot of other good ones, Chris Hedges, Jimmy Dore. But she wrote a book called Shock Doctrine. And that book literally changed, that book changed how I saw capitalism. And she goes back to the CIA, the shock and awe in terms of their experiments with people on LSD, and then you take that into warfare, and the idea is just to overwhelm the enemy, because when people are overwhelmed, their minds aren't functioning and they just become shocked and submissive. And so that's what I think of when I think of shock and awe. It's a doctrine of war, and it's also, it somehow relates to the experiments, the MK Ultra experiments that the CIA did on people and so forth. But help me out. I feel like I'm getting lost here.
Well, I don't think you are, because I think that that sort of mentality is the one that's carried over in everything. I mean, we talk about how, shock and awe doctrine is the way that we do foreign policy. That's true. But I've said this before on the show that, what you do to other people, you will eventually turn around and do
Mm,
it internally as
mhm.
well. and especially when you're talking about the state and nation's
Mhm.
policy. And so it's important to recognize that that mentality of utter shock and then domination after the shock, when we do that externally, we are also preparing to do that internally. And there's been this sort of exchange back and forth of doing that both internally and externally in America. And I think you can make a pretty clear case that a lot of that comes back to the way that we have handled the West and the way the West was colonized back in the 19th century.
So
And I,
talk a little bit more about what we do to others. What do we do to other peoples ends up being turned around on us. Talk a little bit more about that. And I want to mention that this week I read a couple of books on the Phoenix program the author's name escapes me temporarily, but that actually, the Phoenix program was done in Vietnam, and the pattern of that became the pattern that was used in Iraq. It became the pattern for Homeland Security.
Mhm. Yeah. So what I mean by that is, you have to build this ideological foundation, right, to justify what you're doing, right? And so in America, and we've talked about this in other situations, we sort of have built up, as you mentioned, through the Cold War and Vietnam. We have built up this idea that if you are justified in conquering another land, a sovereign state or a sovereign land, then it justifies just about anything that you could possibly do to those people, right? And so you build up um, a material apparatus in order to do that, right? You build up the CIA, you build up military intelligence, you build up actual military tactics to do those things that you want to do, like what we did in Vietnam with just absolutely wiping out entire populations and entire lands in order to bring them under our control. But once you have built that apparatus, there's nothing there to tell you that you should undo the apparatus once the mission is complete, you know? And from there, you have to find another place to point the gun, so to speak. You know what I mean? Because if
And you
you,
want to find another place to point the gun because the reason for Vietnam was not strictly against communism, but it's protecting and defending the worldwide capitalist system. So if that's your goal, then Vietnam is a battle in that war, and the Phoenix program is a tool in your toolbox.
yes. So it's easy to think of this dialectically, where if the material base is we have a world capitalist system that must be upheld in order to continue keeping the money flowing in, right? The material basis of just we have to do this in order to keep our markets in good shape. And then you have to build the ideological justification for it, right? And once you build the ideological justification for it, you build the material military apparatuses to do that, right? But as you just said, you
What
don't
do you
want
mean
to.
by ideological justification? What are we talking about there?
So in the case of like Vietnam, for example, it would be, well, we have to defeat communism. It's an existential threat. We have to convince people that it's an existential threat, and then we have to put it in people's heads that ideologically we're at war with these people. These people will have no negotiation. They won't back down. We have to stop them at any cost, right? That's the sort of ideological miasma you want people floating in, so to speak. And I think
And it's
that,
always couched in terms of defense, like there's a threat to us. Now, like one of the German, really high up German guys, Goebbels or Goring, I think it was Goring, who said, and this was at the Nuremberg trials, who said that, it doesn't matter whether you're in a fascist country or a democracy or anything else, the poor slob on the farm is not going to want to leave the farm unless you convince him that he's under attack.
yeah.
So it's all about couching it in terms of defense. And in the Middle East, you have Israel always under an existential threat. Anything that you say is that it's against Zionism ends up becoming anti-Semitism and ends up becoming, oh, you want to destroy the state of Israel. But I digress.
I think that that's a good point, and to sort of loop back to our original topic with this book by Ketchum, I think that you can see this dialectic at play, this sort of exchange between the material need, the ideological justification, and then the material basis that you're going to build to actually take the thing. I think you can see that in the Old West. You can see that with Manifest Destiny, and you can see how that's permeated the West since we started colonizing the West. There was this belief that if we don't move out, we are at an existential threat. We are in danger if we don't conquer this territory. And I think that's a real powerful draw for people that to this day persists.
You say there's a danger if we don't conquer this territory. Chomsky talks a lot about how if you go back to John Quincy Adams, John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State. This was the early 1800s. John Quincy Adams was elected president, I think, in 1824, but prior to that, he was Secretary of State under either Madison or Monroe. And where was I getting? Oh, it's the idea. And then George W. Bush, whoever but it's this idea, the way that we exist is to expand. The way we defend ourselves is to expand. You have to always be expanding. Otherwise it's like grow or die.
Right. And it's older than America, that mentality. It's far older than America. You look at any empire, and it's always been that mentality. Before we started recording, we were talking about the late Han Dynasty in China. We're talking like 200 AD. And that mentality was present then. You know what I mean? It's a very, very old idea, and it's a very, very old way of justifying atrocity, and the fact that we are still slaves to history, in a sense, that we have not broken that, is I think very dangerous, because gosh, we still write speculative science fiction about expanding and colonizing other planets and stuff for the same reasons, with the same justifications, which is just mind-blowing to me that we're still in this place.
Well, let's talk a little bit. We were talking about the Transcontinental Railroad and the Buffalo, which are, this town ain't big enough for the two of us. So it's either going to be the Transcontinental Railroad or the Buffalo. It can't be both. So it says, let's talk about the story we were told versus what you believe now. And then we talk about that a little bit, and then we'll read a little bit from the book about what it has to say about the buffalo and how it was kind of taken out as a species.
Sure.
So what did you learn about it in school, and how is that different from how you see it now?
It's very funny because there's really no way to talk about what has been done to the buffalo and the people who relied on the buffalo, speaking of the Native Americans, in a way that isn't tragic. There's really no way to frame it. Mm-hmm. And as a child, even growing up with the sort of propagandizing that I grew up with, in school, that was still understood as a tragedy, but very often as a sort of necessary tragedy, a justified tragedy.
Yeah, like Macbeth is a tragedy, but Macbeth was a bad guy.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like
he got what was coming to him.
Right. And it's sometimes sort of put that way, of saying, well, the natives, we couldn't find a way to cooperate without, destroying them and having a successful society built sort of alongside them. That was sort of how it was taught, that it was just impossible.
It's inevitable.
Yeah, exactly. And that just sort of forecloses on any alternative understandings of the situations. It sort of reifies the idea that there's only one way that this could have ever gone, and you might as well never question the alternatives.
I like what you say about it forecloses any other way of thinking about it. That's what a narrative does. So when you're stuck in a narrative, there are certain things that you can't do within that narrative. Like if you're always talking about the lesser of two evils between the two parties, then you're not going to be able to talk about what's the alternative to the two-party system. And I see people who know that the two-party system sucks, but you're stuck in this lesser of two evils, short-term myopic mentality, and you're not able to do anything with that.
Mhm.
So, but I was majorly digressing there. Let me read a little bit from the book, and we'll talk about, the Transcontinental Railroad versus the buffalo, and the white man society versus the indigenous Plains Indians. It says, the buffalo fed, reading from the book This Land by Christopher Ketchum, the buffalo fed, fueled, clothed the Plains Indians. It was a sacred animal, a holy spirit. It was the linchpin of their physical and spiritual survival. So imagine organizing not only your lifestyle, but your religion around a certain aspect of nature. It was everything to them. It was their livelihood and their religion. It says this relationship needed to end if the white man was to take the plains. Titanic capital investments depended on it, namely those of the railroad companies whose interests the federal government worked in large part to protect. By annihilating the buffalo, the United States would destroy the commissary of the tribes, starve them, subjugate them. The Union Pacific's transcontinental bid would pay off, and manifest destiny riding the rails would be fulfilled.
Yeah, and right there, what the author is pointing at was kind of what we were talking about, that there was exactly one outcome that could be acceptable, you know, and it was an outcome that was sort of predetermined, that was not negotiated with all parties. Otherwise, there would have been further discussion with the Plains Indians to try to figure out a way to collaborate together. Um, and we just had to do this because there was no other way that it could
So you say
possibly
there was only one outcome that was acceptable. Only one outcome that was acceptable to whom?
to the white man who was colonizing America, right? That is what it is, and I'm glad you point that out because this was not negotiated. This was not something that was concocted in collaboration. This was one party, out of the many involved that had
I'm going to
one
make a
outcome.
distinction here. I'm going to make a distinction between the white man and rich white men.
Thank you. Go ahead. Please speak to that. Go ahead, because you got it.
Well, it's the rich white men were who makes decisions. So a lot of problems that we have in the world today get blamed on human nature. And I say global warming is not about human nature. It's about the nature of the humans that are in the top 1% or the top fraction of 1%. It's like Jimmy Dore always says, and I love this. It's like, if you want to find out what the problems are, don't blame people that have no power and no money. If
Yeah.
you want to know what the problems are and why, you want to know the source of the problem, blame the people that have the power and the money to change things, or the power and the money to keep things the same.
Yeah, that is a brilliant distinction, and I think that so often we sort of get lost in saying, and maybe this is controversial, so I apologize. I certainly don't mean it with any negative intent, but I think a lot of the times we say, well, it was the white people who did this. That's true, but more specifically, it was, as you say, the capitalist class of white people, right? Again, almost entirely white, if not entirely white, but specifically, it was in the interest of the capitalist class of white people. That's really where the root of it comes into play, right? That was the root of the issue, was that it was their interests guiding, not even the poor vagrant white workers who frankly didn't have any stake either way. Their lives probably would have been just the same had
Well,
manifest destiny
the
not.
rich white people that have the power and the money to call the shots and tell you how things are going to be, they have the power to make people poor and desperate, so that
Mhm.
the poor and desperate people want to go west and establish a plot of land, or be workers, be railroad workers and things like that.
gold miners and all the rest. I mean, you can see this, and to speak slightly to the idea of the cowboy, as we know, looking back now, a lot of those cowboys were not white, you know.
Mhm.
And so because of the capitalist class of white people, and their mission, there was a large group of non-white people, poor people, who suddenly felt that their best option was to join up and kill Indians and kill the buffalo, because because of the capitalist white men, they really had very little other options to carve out like a dignified life, or a life that they could feel fulfilled in.
Now, how does this relate to the Civil War? Because the Civil War occurred during this time period. And during this time period, early on, slavery existed. And then later on, slavery was not a thing anymore, even though we resumed different, slavery in a different form. But how does the labor of that, how does the labor market, what can we say about the labor market during this time and how Black slaves played into that, the slave owners played into that? Anyway, is that
This
too
is
open-ended?
No, this is actually a wonderful question. And I would recommend a book by Matt Karp called This Vast Southern Empire.
Mhm.
I think you and I have talked about it before privately, but I would recommend it for anyone interested, because Matt Karp, who now writes for Jacobin magazine, by the way, he makes a pretty compelling case that one of the foundational struggles that led to the Civil War was the expansionist policy of the slave owning class in the American South. He was saying that white slave owners had this very expansive idea of how to grow the strength of the slave markets. And one of the main ways that they were doing it was by fighting to have these Western states that were being colonized be slave states, right? It's often said, well, oh, they were fighting for states' rights. Well, no, they were fighting for their rights to hold slaves in
Right,
spite of the federal government,
right,
but they actually were trying to impose on these newly colonized states in the West, as well as places south and east of our border.
right,
Um, they were imposing the slave system on these states because they wanted to expand the slave empire, so to speak.
right.
And I think that that's a really good point, because what you had with the Civil War was a sort of interclass dispute about the future of the labor market, whereas the northern states, still capitalist, obviously, wanted a free labor market, and so as they expanded into the West, they wanted those to be free states.
Your air quotes are working overtime when you say free,
I know.
free labor market.
I know. But meanwhile, the southern states, as they expanded west, wanted to expand and make those enslaved states. So a huge part of the Civil War was just a debate over what the labor market was going to look like as we expanded west. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a great point.
Well, what is normally neglected in our history in terms of the Civil War? I mean, I learned a lot about the Civil War maybe 4 or 5 years ago prior to becoming a leftist, and I really wasn't seeing the Civil War and leading up to it, but I'm not sure how relevant it is anymore if you don't look at, that you have a very tiny fraction of people north and south that own the capital, and they're trying to make the money, and cotton fueled the Industrial Revolution. That at that stage, cotton was the fuel of the all of a sudden worldwide there's a market for this fiber that all of a sudden is making people have cheap, comfortable clothes. And so if you're a person with money and you want more money, then you're going to exploit the Black slave labor, and you're going to exploit the land. I mean, part of the reason they wanted to expand westward was so that they'd have more votes in Congress, especially the Senate. There was always a equal number of slave states versus free states. So the Southerners were gung ho about the Mexican-American War because they wanted to, they conquered, we went and stole a third of Mexico, and all of those are different states. They're south of the Mason-Dixon line, so that's thought to be fair game for being slave territory. But I kind of know the political aspect of it, but I haven't thought very much about the capital aspect of it. And the capital aspect of it is if you want money, you want more money, you're going to extract it from people, you're going to extract it from governments, and you're going to extract it from natural resources.
And further, you're going to try to shape the world market in such a way that your mode of production is replicated. It's sort of lost that the Southern Empire was also extremely.
Say that again. You're going to shape the world market so that your mode of production is replicated. Talk about that.
So the Southern states, and I keep calling it the Southern Empire because that's kind of how they saw themselves.
Oh yeah.
Was in close collaboration with Cuba and Brazil, right? These were two places, the two of the last holdouts of having this kind of chattel slavery and using the transatlantic slave trade as their primary labor force. And their big plan was to compete with England, right, which was sort of on the cutting edge of moving away from chattel slavery and toward the sort of quote unquote free labor market that the northern states were using.
Air quotes working overtime, free labor market.
As always. And so the main argument was that, look, if England catches hold with this free labor market, then our negotiating power on the world stage goes way down. Because if more places are using this mode of production that Great Britain's using, the northern states are using, that puts us at a disadvantage on the global market. So they wanted to expand not just to control the American government, but the world market. Because it wasn't just cotton; it was also sugar. Sugar was a massive cash cow, especially south of our borders in these slave countries. And so I think that also has to be considered, that the expansion was seen as necessary so that there would be more power on the world market as well as the domestic one.
So what do we make of that?
Ooh, that this form of an economy can spin us in a whole lot of really nasty directions, and that there is a self-reinforcing kind of relationship between the mode of production and the ideology of a nation, and that's just Marxism 101, obviously, but I think that without understanding that relationship, you're not going to understand the past, and you're certainly not going to understand the present. It's very hard to understand what's happening in the western part of this country right now if you don't understand that self-reinforcing relationship between the way we identify ourselves and the way that we make money.
The western part of the country right now? Oh, you talk about cattle ranchers stuff?
Yeah, cattle ranchers and
let's talk about a few of the ways. The author, Christopher Ketchum, if you're just joining us, we're talking about This Land by Christopher Ketchum, how Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption are ruining the American West. Ketchum writes, look across the public lands and you'll find the myriad uses: oil and gas fields in the deserts and steppe, and coal, copper, silver, and gold mines stabbed into cliffs and mountains. Forests are felled, grasslands overgrazed, wildlife slaughtered, and roads carved for all parties to gain access and exploit public ground for private gain. The Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service are schizoid. With the one hand they protect, with the other hand they ravage. Such is multiple use. So multiple use is this term that says we're going to have multiple uses for the public land. We're going to have it, partly for people to enjoy. We're going to have part of it for profit. And then the profit motive ends up taking over everything. And the public ends up massively subsidizing the private profits of a few people who know how to work the system and extract money from it.
Yeah, and I've talked a lot about how that reinforcement, right? So you have the material need to accumulate wealth in this particular way, right? This capitalist mode of production. And I think that you see the reinforcement, the understanding of, well, it's the only way to serve public interest is to boost private profits, right? Because they're generating wealth, they're creating jobs. We see this constantly, talks of fracking
Right.
and talks of
You know what's interesting to me is that they always couch this in terms of the common good. So they want the capitalism and the free market system to be seen as creating the common good. And what they don't, but you can't talk about the common good when you're talking about social programs. As soon as you start wanting to do want social programs for the common good, they accuse you of being a communist. Oh, that's been tried and it failed, and that's Soviet Union, and that's authoritarian. But even the people that are after the private gain, they want us to believe that this is good for everybody.
Right, exactly. And people buying in on that is sort of you're required to convince people of that for them to buy in and find this acceptable. What's been interesting lately to me, and I'm going to be sort of, now that we've had this conversation, I really want to track the way that that's sort of put to people, because I think we're seeing less and less people convinced by this notion, that it's in the public good to support the private gains. And I'm starting to wonder if that matters. I'm starting to wonder how much it matters anymore if people buy into that ideology, because I don't think as many people believe it as they used to.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. A couple of interesting points here. African American people have, as a voting group, are typically further left than any other voting group.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's partly, they see the system for what it is. They see it more clearly. It's not so much middle-aged Black men that are having a midlife crisis. It's middle-aged white men that are having a midlife crisis because the stuff they believed in, it's like not so so there's all this layers and layers of ideology, layers and layers of rhetoric that doesn't fit the reality.
Yeah, I think that that's being exposed more and more every day. People joke that the Trump presidency is sort of the mask off presidency. It's where it's the death of satire. Everything's just sort of, it's just as blunt and obvious as it could possibly be. And I think that's true. And I think there's a potential there for people to sort of, I know this sounds corny, but just sort of like wake up and recognize like they're being lied to. But I do wonder how much that matters, because I think that there is a certain situation, and I think David Harvey has talked about this. David Harvey, for those who don't know him, the great thinker and Marxist theorist and anthropologist and geographer and
professor at City College of New York.
Yeah. Before I decided to stay in Louisville and forgo the academic path, I actually was applying at the City College of New York exclusively so I could learn under him.
Wow.
Yeah,
I'm impressed.
He's a heck of a guy and a heck of a teacher. But he has written as a Marxist himself. I think we may be at a point where it doesn't matter so much whether people buy in, and it doesn't matter so much what we do, because the system is so firmly entrenched that it might be, near impossible to dislodge. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this as more of our ecologically minded host.
Well, tell me what you mean by that. The system is so firmly entrenched, it might be impossible to dislodge.
So he was mainly talking about resource development.
Let me preface by saying, at this juncture, the worry that many of us have is whether it could swing left or right.
Sure.
And it's any man's guess as to which way it goes. Is that what you're getting at? Or what do you mean by the system so firmly entrenched that we don't know where it's going to go?
So that's a good question, and it's a little different from what I'm talking about,
Okay.
what you
Yeah.
said. So
Sure.
what I was referring to was when he talks about this, he says that, you know, the procurement, distribution, the sort of logistical side of supplying the country with necessities and food,
Mhm.
is firmly under capitalist control, right? The distribution and production of resources.
Mhm.
And what he's saying is it's so expansive and so thorough and dug in so deep
Mhm.
that any disruption of that could cause mass famines, for example. You think about how a lot of the food we produce in this country is produced in just a few select locations and then distributed all over the place, right? And what he's saying is when that's the case, it's going to be really hard. Like, let's say there was a left wing takeover or even a farther right wing takeover, how you said it could swing either direction, whatever. It may be that if there's any disruption to the current way that we distribute resources, that it will be very difficult to get those resources out to people without significant delays that could lead to mass catastrophe. And
What form would those changes take? I'm a little bit lost as to, what crisis are we dealing here? What system is it that's going to break down that no longer is able to deliver food?
I think what he's referring to would be our systems of distribution, our systems of um, commerce, for example. And that could be a major challenge that I'm not sure how much research has been done on how to do that with a very just, equitable transition.
See what you think of this. I think I don't. Anyway, what am I trying to say? It's easy for me to imagine a situation where things continue getting delivered to people who have money. And the question is, what do you do if you don't have money?
Yeah, no, and that's sort of the dual crisis that we're looking at, right? Is that the current system is starting to break down, and I think we're seeing that in the West. How we've been talking about westward expansion, and we're seeing it start to break down with the ecological destruction. The land is not as arable as it once was, um, and I think that's the singular crisis. The other
At the,
crisis
Go ahead.
is that system too big to fail? Do you see what I'm saying here? And that's the real danger, and that's my real fear.
Mhm.
Is this system is too big to continue, but it's also too big to fail.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Well, I look around me and I see, I mean, Kentucky and Indiana have such fertile land, and you grew up on a farm, and, I see underutilized land everywhere.
Mhm.
There's so much land that's available to grow vegetables, for one thing. There's so much land. Anybody, you can grow chickens, you know, anywhere. You
Sure,
can almost grow chickens in an apartment if you wanted to.
sure.
And so the question in my mind, there's all this underutilized land, and we have, I have this riff where I say reduce all of the following by 90%, reduce defense by 90%, reduce air travel by 90%, reduce newly manufactured cars by 90%, on and on and on. Okay, reduce supply chains by 90%. These long supply chains, reduce those by 90%. There's no reason for us to get a third of our vegetables from California. Um, it, I don't pretend to know how that's going to play out. I just see a ton of underutilized resources all around us.
Yeah, and I think that that's where you get to a question of how do you break the chain, right? Because we've been talking a lot about how, that sort of material need to accumulate produces the ideology, which produces the material apparatus to extract, blah, 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 blah,
Hmm.
right? So
You keep
My thing
saying
is,
that, I'm going to get it. I'm going to learn it here. You keep saying that, and I'm going to get it after a little while.
that's my job. It's to try to just repeat things until I beat you over the
But
head with the
but I
information.
like what you just said about that. You have the material need to accumulate, which produces the ideology, which produces the apparatus, which continues the process.
Right. And they all reinforce one another. And so the thing is, I don't think that you can. All right. So if we go at this backwards, right, we need a new apparatus that uses all that land that you were talking about, this land that's not being utilized, right? So how do we build that apparatus? Well, you can't build that apparatus when you still have that ideology in place, that sort of cowboy ideology in place, right? But then you can't undo that ideology in place if you don't undo the material need to continue accumulating in this way. Do you
Right.
see it? Does that make sense?
So one application in my mind of what you just said is that we need things like UBI and
Mhm.
Medicare for all. So there's not this desperate need to make money.
Mhm.
Not only is there not so much of a desperate need to make money at the level of survival, but there's not as much perceived need to accumulate a bunch of stuff for retirement. Because if I'm going to have a universal basic income, I'm not going to be sweating retirement so much. And
Right.
if I have health care that's provided as a human right, then I won't be, freaking out with how am I going to get health care for my kids.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So then people have more time to stay at home and grow the garden if that's what you want to do. Kentucky is among the most fertile land in the country, and for us to I just look all around me and I see it not being used for stuff that matters, either for human food or for habitat. When you just see lawn and non-native trees, that's an ecological desert, and we
Mhm.
need that to be ecologically rich and abundant. It's a because we have a mass extinction going on. It's
Mhm.
been going on for 50 years. That's the blink of an eye in geologic time. Nope, nothing bigger than a squirrel survives a mass extinction. We need to wake up and start talking about what really matters. By we, I meaning Trump and Biden and the Republicans and Democrats need to start talking about what matters. Anyway, go
I'll
ahead.
make sure to hold my breath on them on them coming around on that. But yeah,
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 right.
no, right. That's the bummer. We couldn't even laugh about that, could we?
Oh, I know, I know.
um,
It's
but
like
but
Jimmy Dore talks about Trump being the death of comedy, because try making fun of Trump. It's like, ugh,
God, there's nothing funny about this. Yeah,
I know,
exactly.
I know.
But yeah, that's the big thing, isn't it? Is just that you have to break this chain somehow. And I am under the belief that without those transformative policies, the ones that you were talking about, the ones
So
that
you say we
undermine.
have to break this chain somehow. What do you mean by this chain? What are you talking about?
Oh, I was referencing that sort of dialectic that I was talking about between the apparatus, the ideology, the material needs. You know what I mean? That you got to undermine that chain. I think undermine rather than break is a
Hmm.
better word, because I think that the
How
point.
about disempower?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a good one too. Like you have to be able to disarm sort of that material need to expand and constantly consume. Because if you can undermine that, that's when you can actually make these kinds of changes that we're talking about. Because I think that if you just eat around the edges and just sort of do these, like the Paris Climate Accord, that kind of thing, if you just do things like that, you're not going to undermine the root. And if you don't undermine the root, it'll just keep popping up somewhere else. And I think we've seen that, like with what Ketchum's talking about. There are a lot of holes in the dam right now. You know what I mean?
What do you mean holes in the dam?
Well, there's so overdevelopment in
Hmm.
California.
Hmm.
That's a major issue. I know Mike Davis, a good academic. He's been making the rounds, doing interviews with podcasts and journalistic outlets and stuff. And he's talked about overdevelopment of real estate property in California as being a major disruptor of the local fauna in California.
Hmm.
So you have overdevelopment. You have invasive species like cattle in the West that are just not meant to be in a dry environment, like in California, for example. So there's another thing. You have all of this need, so-called need, in a place like Kentucky, which is very fertile, like you were talking about, where we're just using this land for things that are completely unproductive. You know what I mean? And then of course there's the fact that there are businesses that have a material incentive to pollute, you know? So there's a million different ways that this problem is asserting itself over and over again.
Let's talk. Let's talk about. I'm going to quote the book again, and the thing about this book is it's a beautiful book with a lot of beautiful stories. It also has a lot of bad news in it, and it added to my collection of stuff that goes on in this world that's really crazy and stupid. And I want to add to our audience's repertoire of things that are going on in the world that are really crazy and stupid. So Christopher Ketchum is an investigative reporter. I'm going to do number 11 if you're looking at this document. But he's an investigative reporter, and he talks about this machine called a bullhog. And this bullhog is just going to chew up the forest in minutes flat. And this is, keep in mind that what's being destroyed is yours and mine. It's public property. It is no less yours and mine than these ranchers that are chewing it up and spitting it out and not even preserving it for the next generation. Ketchum talks about this machine called a bullhog is approaching. Its engine roars. It runs on treads like a bulldozer, and affixed at its front is a spinning bladed cylinder. It has one use and one use only: the destruction of the forest in which I stand, a forest of pinyon and juniper that the Bureau of Land Management manages on our behalf. These ancient trees, gnarled with age, short and squat, with fattened trunks and curling bark, maybe 20 feet at their crowns, a pygmy forest derisively called a woodland and found on tens of millions of acres in Utah and Nevada. Should I say Nevada or Nevada?
Tomato.
Right. So one more paragraph about the bullhog, and we're going to see what this SOB does. The bullhog, operated and funded by the Department of the Interior at our expense with our tax dollars. We're paying for this big, heavy equipment. At our expense and with our tax dollars, charges through the forest as I stand in a kind of fugue, incredulous at the pace of its destruction. The beautiful, old, gnarled trees are devoured in the mouth of the mobile mulcher, knocked down and chewed up, defecated out its ass in fragments. The howl and whine of the engine and the spinning blades, the torturous toppling of the trees, the cracking and crushing of trunks and limbs, the shattered spitting out of beings alive seconds before. It is almost too much to bear. What's left is a flattened, denuded, tread-smashed wasteland, a bombed Dresden of pinyon Jupiter. Within 15 minutes, the forest that I entered is gone. This is happening, or is planned to happen, in an area roughly the size of Vermont.
It's nearly apocalyptic.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that.
Well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
It feels apocalyptic because this is what he's describing is the complete and utter destruction of an order, of a harmony. I think that we've talked a lot about sort of ideological domination and sort of like ideological monopoly too, and it's important to remember that nature itself is an order. Nature itself has a harmony. And I think that when you live in
you were talking last week about if something has been around as long as it has, that's a good indication that maybe you should leave it alone.
Right. And I think that, as to loop back to what we were saying at the beginning, this understanding that there is only one way right? That this order, as prescribed by sort of the capitalist class of, at this point, mostly not all white men and maybe not 100% white men, but mostly still to this day, that order that they have in mind is the only order deemed acceptable, or even an order at all, you know? And I think that that's what scares me the most, maybe, about this sort of the business class, the capitalist class, is that they sort of disregard any other way of existing as being out of order or out of line, and we have to impose order on something that has gone without our yoke. And that is the cowboy ethos, that is the capitalist ethos, that is the business ethos, and it is destroying things that have had an order for longer than we've even been a species.
So is this inevitable, and are conservatives capable of seeing this?
I, it's only inevitable if the
For
material
that matter,
circumstances
are the
remain.
Joe Biden Democrats capable of seeing this?
Right. I don't think that they are, because
Here's a fact. In 7 out of Obama's 8 years, he took more timber from public lands than George Bush ever did in a single year. In 7 of his 8 years, he outdid George W. Bush
Mhm.
in taking timber from public lands. Not Bush's average, but on Bush's best year, he only in one of Bush's best years did he outdo Obama in removing timber from public lands.
I'm glad that you point that out, because it sort of points to the fact that both of our parties in our two-party system they have capitalistic bases. The roots are in this capitalist ethos, the cowboy ethos, whatever you want to call it. And as long as that root is there, as long as that material need to accumulate in this way is there, then no, I don't think they'll ever see it. Or if they do see it, they'll chew around the edges of it. They'll say, well, we'll try to do it better. We'll try to do it more ethically. They always say that it's always more
I like
ethical.
saying Obama is the kind and gentle face of empire. He's the
Mhm.
he's the polite and well-mannered face of, what am I trying to say? Drone bombing and things like that.
Right. Yeah. He won't shoot you face to face, but he'll do it from the skies. He won't just go in and bulldoze the native forest. He'll do it ethically and with a plan, and with all this sort of like stuff. And that's the best we can hope for, as long as we have this material underpinning, this capitalist underpinning.
So
And
what's the solution, Jake?
socialism. I mean, seriously, that's the only thing that I can think of, because, as I said, as long as there is that root material need to dominate and accumulate and consume, then I don't think you're going to stop this. So I think that a
So
truly
what's the
honest,
first step in that direction, and the first step in the right direction?
I think anything that increases democracy in this country is of the utmost importance.
But we know
And
socialism is authoritarian. I mean, look at the Soviet Union. Look at Maoist China. So the socialism is authoritarian. What are you talking about democracy?
I think, honestly, you can see true inspiration from the left-wing movements of Latin America.
Right,
You can see it from
right.
Evo Morales, for example,
Oh
a
man.
man who has fought for indigenous rights. I believe he himself is an indigenous man,
Yeah.
and fought to protect the natural environment, not only for the sake of the indigenous people, but just for the environment's sake. And I think that expanding the voices, or expanding the power of indigenous people and people who have been marginalized and oppressed in our society, is a massive step forward. I'm not going to say it's going to solve everything, obviously not, but it is a massive step forward, in order to tackle these problems. You see it in Brazil, that the left-wing movements there, one of their primary goals is the protection of the rainforests and the protections of native lands. And you can see how the right wing, like Bolsonaro, run explicitly on the campaign promise of doing exactly this, bulldozing the forests and putting out cattle to graze. And
Right.
that right there is, I think, the major conflict, is the conflict between an expansive, genuine democracy and this sort of business class monopolizing all political power. So I think siding with true democracy is quite a strong step forward.
That's what I always, I look at at Biden, and I'm thinking has nothing to do with democracy.
Right, right.
I mean, my liberal friends, can we talk? This has nothing to do. He stole the nomination from the people's candidate. And
Yep.
It's not just about one guy,
No.
but show me democracy and then we'll talk.
Yeah.
I mean, no matter what the issue is, war, healthcare, show me democracy and then we'll talk. If it's not democracy, then it's a spectator sport.
Yeah.
And you can have all the opinions and all the passion you want. And if it's a spectator sport, then you're not on the field and you're not making decisions, then it's not a democracy.
And this is, and I guess I'll end it on this, on my point, is that democracy is not just a ballot. Democracy is also a union. Democracy.
No, I'm kidding.
Well, hey, you took it there. I didn't. Democracy is a union. Democracy is workplace organizing, community organizing. Democracy is, just to put it as plainly as possible, getting your hands into the community and working to make it better for the community, right? And so
democracy is when you get to vote on what affects you, and it's not just getting control of Washington, D.C. It's having input into every level. There's a place for Washington, D.C. There's a place for the UN that we don't allow it to have. There's a place for international government, and there's a place for state and regional. There's a place for county. There's a place for local. There's a place for workplace democracy. There's a place for guilds and unions. So,
no, I couldn't agree anymore. I think that you just nailed everything that I wanted to say. It's interesting. I think this conversation we've just had is less didactic than the ones that we usually have, but it's generated a lot of thought processes for me, and I hope it did for you too.
Well, we have, thank you for your kind words, but one last thing that I wanted to say, and I'm going to have to pause. So here's one last thought, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. But to me, it's like the closer you get to the local level, the less politics, the less this national tribalism, Democrat, Republican, the less that comes into play. And I think it's also true, the more you get to the facts, the less the tribalism matters. I think some conservatives, I mean, my parents were actually, conservatives that believed in conservation, but I think when you get to, but the closer you get to the facts, the less ideology matters. I think if more people knew about this machine that's chewing up a forest in 15 minutes, and not for our benefit, but for the benefit of some guy that's stealing from us. You might have to change the language a little bit, but you talk about law and order, you talk about theft, you talk about the future generations that are not going to have this land because one bozo chewed it up. Is that the society we want? So how's that sound? I want to get your thoughts on that.
I think you nailed it. I think that once you start talking about things that materially matter to someone's day-to-day life, it's much easier to think about politics as a generative process rather than a combative one, which I think is much more productive in most cases.
That's a great place to leave it. Jake, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And to our audience, come back again soon.
Thanks.